Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our final panel on zones of exclusion in the city of neighborhoods. My name is Katie Hyde, and I am a second-year law student and Toll Public Interest Scholar at Penn Law. A full century before the Civil Rights Movement, the visionary Philadelphian Octavius Cato sat down on the segregated horse-drawn Pine Street trolley car and refused to leave. He remained there all night, igniting a movement of civil disobedience against racial segregation on Philadelphia's public transit that persisted until the passage of a state law integrating the trolley car network. The movement for transportation and mobility justice in this country runs through this city. But the transit inequalities that Cato saw in the 1860s continue to manifest today. In hostile architecture proliferating in SEPTA stations, in laws which deny basic transportation access to immigrant communities, and in bike paths which remain accessible to far too few of our community members. Reflecting on a lifetime of resistance work, Octavius Cato called on his community to agitate and work by our means and our influence in court and out of court, asking aid of the members of the law to assert the principles of the profession by granting us justice and right, until these invidious and unjust usages shall have ceased. Today, I am so honored to be joined by two activists and advocates who are doing exactly that. Wafia Murray is Indigo Program Manager for the City of Philadelphia, and Yasha Zarenkelk is the Coalition Manager and Community Organizer for Transit Forward Philadelphia. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Patty Torres of Make the Road, Pennsylvania, was unable to join us today due to a family emergency. Patty is an organizer and leader in the fight to expand driver's licenses to undocumented Pennsylvanians, a cause that is very near and dear to my heart. Her work is tremendously important, and we are very sorry that she couldn't be here with us today, but I encourage you to look at her bio in the program and engage with her work. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping matters. If you have a question during the event, please submit it to the Toll Public Interest Center through the Q&A function. We will then answer questions during the Q&A at the end of our panel discussion. If you would like subtitles for today's event, please click the button on the bottom of your Zoom screen that says Live Transcript. Then select Show Transcript, and it should provide live subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the option, please send a chat to Toll Public Interest Center and we will address it. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced 3 times during this panel. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credit. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email, but if you didn't receive the email, if you're on this webinar, please find the link to the evaluation in the chat. These passwords will tell us how long you attended today's event. At this time, I will announce the first of 3 CLE passwords. The first CLE password is CITY, C-I-T-Y. Again, that's CITY, C-I-T-Y. Okay, let's get started. How does systemic inequality manifest on Philadelphia's buses, trolleys, roads, and bike paths? How has our built environment in this city and the laws which enable and uphold it created inequality? And Yasha, I'd love if we could start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone who's on this call today. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak on these really, really big issues. And I was also really happy to see Dr. Destiny Thomas on the previous panel. I had the privilege of being able to work with her, and all of the work that she does is phenomenal and amazing. So this is a huge honor. But to really talk about this issue of systemic inequality that, as you said, kind of manifests on all of Philadelphia's transportation systems, I think it really speaks to what we mean when we say the word mobility justice. And one really great definition that I like to use for identifying what is mobility justice, or what is the crisis of mobility that we're facing, that we have been facing for the longest time, was put together by Dr. Mimi Scheller, who was a former professor and director of the transportation department at Drexel University. But she identified there to be three crises that were going on that identified, that made up the mobility or immobility problems that were occurring. And those were a climate change crisis, an urbanization crisis, and a refugee crisis or a migration crisis. And I think that's kind of spelled out in the three panelists that Katie and this group have put together. But speaking about the urbanization crisis and how has the built environment and the laws which have been able to uphold it have kind of created inequality? Well, the laws that have been put into place, things like urban growth, the spread of automobility, essentially, like an interlocking of cars, highways, fueling infrastructure, government policies, and car culture that are all upheld by laws and policies made by our legislature. Things like extensive urban sprawl and splintered accessibility, land grabs, and mass evictions, all I feel like consist and make up of this urbanization crisis. And these are all things that are sanctioned by our government in the name of profit and in the name of quote unquote urbanization, and which have ultimately led to inequality. And with that, I'll let Wafia speak to what those inequalities are.
Thank you, Yasha. So yeah, totally agree with everything that Yasha just mentioned. I mean, when you look at the inequality of, transit, roads, rails, busways, even bike lanes, just look at where routes lead to. People, if you have to travel in the center city, then yeah, you're pretty good. But what if you work outside of center city? What if you work, in other areas of Philadelphia? I often have conversations with community members who say, that we have to get jobs that are further out, and to get there by transit, it takes me an extra hour and a half just because I may have to take multiple buses to get to that location, or the buses don't run as frequently in those locations. The same can be said for, bikeways and the bike network and where it originally is, and how you see less, bike infrastructure in some of the communities that are further away from center cities. So you really see it. We all know about the history of redlining and all of those things, and it really takes an effect of how, certain transportation options and certain even railways and roads were built to separate and segregate people as opposed to bringing them together. And though there is a lot of work being done to help correct those past wrongs and start a new way, but a lot of that institutional and systematic racism in those structures still exists. And so we really have to, we're working our way through a system that was built against a lot of people. So a lot of that still exists. And like I said, there's a lot being done to help, fix past wrongs and try to, start a new process where it is more community led, and we have community members at the table to help with decision making. But, there's still a lot to be done. And so that's how you see a lot of those inequities really showing up in, the transportation networks that you see today.
Yeah, and I want to add to what Wafia was describing in terms of, there is I think as a advocate or quote unquote person who is paying attention and seeing these things that are happening within our transit system, it seems obvious, but it may not necessarily be as obvious, but there is an obvious segregation and discrimination happening within the actual transit system itself, in that a system like SEPTA's regional rail, which caters to mostly white, suburban, higher income population and residents, has received larger amounts of funding than SEPTA's city transit division, which serves the buses, the trolleys, the Broad Street line, the Market Frankford line. And then the simple fact that our regional rail system within city limits actually operates at a higher speed and could be accessible to folks living within the city of Philadelphia. Yet SEPTA refuses to reduce the price of regional rail fares for riders within city limits, which could almost immediately expand the accessibility, or essentially, as Wafia was saying, folks who are, having to transfer from one bus to another, or being unable to access a part of the city. The infrastructure is there, the bones are there, yet why policy has not been able to put in place to lower fares for regional rail riders within the city is just one simple and obvious kind of inequality with almost like a simple change that can be done.
I think it's so important to have those like tangible manifestations of the inequality in the built environment. So I appreciate those examples because I think that they're really accessible for those of us who ride SEPTA. How has the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated these inequalities? We know that while many Philadelphians have been able to work from home during the pandemic, many low-income Philadelphians, Philadelphians of color, and Philadelphians without immigration status have continued to use transit, cars, or bicycles to get to work. So how has the pandemic exposed some of the inequalities in the system?
I can start off. I mean, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, like this was it as we talked before, a lot of these systems were inequitable to begin with. And I think, the pandemic just shed even more of a light on how inequitable they really are, and how, when folks with limited resources to begin with are then given even less limited resources, you see the impact, right? Like everyone was hit by the pandemic, but we know a lot of our underserved communities were hit even harder. And transportation was definitely one of those. As you said, a lot of people do not have the luxury to be able to work from home and still have to, use transit. And, with that fear of, just the physical safety of being out and, am I going to be safe on public transit options? But also even, in the beginning when a lot of, different transit options weren't as available, or some lines just completely stopped running for a portion of the time, or even in some places where, bike share systems just, stopped running or left market. So we saw, how transportation just really, how some transportation options were just really taken away without, I don't think, the consideration of those who really need this. Like transportation isn't, it's an asset, right? It's a need, it's a public right. And so to just take that away from someone or limit those options, it really is it really puts people at a disadvantage. And to the pandemic, like I said, really brought more of a light on those situations. It's sad that we have to have a pandemic to really have people wake up and say, oh yeah, there's a lot messed up with the system. Let's try to fix that, when we should have been trying to fix it from the very beginning. But thankfully these conversations are starting to happen, and hopefully change will come from that. But yeah.
Yeah, I think Wafia said it best and said it well, in that transportation, or transit specifically, is a public right and a civil right. Transit Equity Day was last Friday, and one of the key kind of goals of Transit Equity Day is to show and display that public transit is an environmental justice issue. It is a racial justice issue. It is a income disparity issue. It is a a migration issue. It is all of those things. And as Wafia said again, it's really unfortunate that it took a global health crisis to expose those inequalities, but that's usually the case. Whether it's a climate crisis that occurs that exposes what those inequalities are, or something as severe as the pandemic. And it's really unfortunate that it takes something like that to expose what these inequalities are. Another example of using regional rail and city transit as an example of the inequalities. Within, I think it was maybe a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, when the stay-at-home orders or the lockdown orders were put in place, we saw how folks who were still using the buses and the trolleys and the L and the Broad Street line were still depending on public transit. But folks who had the privilege to work from home, regional rail riders, service was immediately cut because the demand for regional rail service wasn't there. But the service and the demand for buses and trolleys and subways was still there because there were still people who needed to get to jobs, who weren't always necessarily working a job from 9 to 5, and still depending on public transit. I think ultimately the pandemic kind of highlighted and displayed how much our cities were designed around the automobile, and how our dependency on automobiles has almost kind of caused us to feel like entitled to drive, and not really recognize that driving or like owning a vehicle is truly a privilege, and that our cities are designed to almost uphold a privilege that not everyone has access to. And I think that's kind of one of the biggest sort of disappointments, maybe to say, that the pandemic, I think, exacerbated.
Zooming out for a moment, Wafia, sidewalks and bike paths are often ignored in conversations about transit equity and justice. What is lost when we leave pedestrians and bikers out of the conversation? And if you can reflect a little bit on the particular access obstacles that these communities face, and how the Indigo program has tackled these barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, anytime there's any type of project, whether it be transportation, housing, anything, right? Anytime you're implementing a project or a program that impacts people, or even so if you're implementing a program that is designed to help provide better access or better service for whomever it includes, it's important to have that audience a part of the conversation. Like, I wouldn't want someone to come and plan something on my property or a house that I own without having a discussion with me first. So I think the same thing goes for, if it's a bike lane, transit, or anything. And so it really comes down to who's a part of the conversation, who's a part of the decision-making process. If you're implementing, a bike lane, or as we do with Indigo, making sure that we're checking in with, the neighborhood, the community, the residents that we're looking to add this service to, and say, hey, first of all, is this something that you think would be useful to your community? If so, how so? Or if there are barriers to the use of it, talking about what those barriers are, and then working together to figure out ways to alleviate some of those barriers. So it really starts with a conversation. It doesn't end with the conversation, though. It should be, I'm really a big proponent of a community-driven decision-making process when there's programs or projects that affect the community, which they all are. So having a process where community members are engaged from the very beginning, and then through the process throughout, right? Like, don't just engage in the beginning and then you don't talk to them, or they hear nothing back from the city or whoever is implementing the project. It's an ongoing process. You want them involved in the idea of it, the planning of it, and then ultimately the implementation and the activation of it, right? We don't want to just put a bike lane or a transit stop or an indigo station in a neighborhood and it's not being used. And that often happens. And they're like, oh, well, they're not using it. They don't want it. No, because you didn't engage them. You didn't include them. You didn't talk to them about how they can use it and what could be helpful so that you can utilize it and so that it can be an access for you. So like, for example, with Indigo, we talk with community members and talk with residents and say, how do you feel about bike share? What are some of your barriers? What can we provide you with to help you use the system more? Affordability, providing low income pass options. So I'm sorry, my 1-year-old is in the background, so you may hear her. But what type of, having a flexible payment options, providing education, encouragement, outreach, classes and rides, having, actual programming with the community at the table, a part of it to really help build that ownership of this, bike share program or whatever you're implementing in the area.
It's so inspiring to hear about a model of community engagement that that centers the community and that includes the community from start to finish. That's wonderful. Yasha, turning to a different topic for a moment. In the last several months, the media has covered several high-profile incidents on SEPTA, including the racially motivated beating of a Central High School student, shootings, and sexual assault. In response, we've seen some groups call for SEPTA to crack down on crime with more quote-unquote boots on the ground. Other stakeholders have argued that transit police is part of the problem, not a solution. What does an abolitionist liberatory future look like for SEPTA riders?
Yeah, I mean, it actually kind of goes back to what Wafia was saying again. It's community control, right? It's the community taking over a public space. Public transit is a public right, and I think it's allowing the community to be a part of the decision-making process of what does safety look like and how do we feel safe. And the transit agency and the city of Philadelphia with its multiple resources, or I'm sorry, any transit agency or any city with all of its resources, coming together to create an environment for community control. And to give SEPTA credit, there have been programs in place that have allowed that. And just really quickly too, when I say community control, I mean community of everyone, that there's no exclusion as to experience level or expertise in a certain field. It includes everyone, the unhoused population, people, riders of public transit, folks who, see the streets and are part of that community every single day. And one way that actually SEPTA has been able to create an environment for communities to feel safer in public transit spaces is through their Hub of Hope program, which allows for a safe place where folks who are experiencing homelessness can take a shower, wash their laundry, speak to peers or resource coordinators, and be able to feel welcomed in this public space. I think when it comes to the issue of policing on transit specifically or at transit stops, I think where we make public transit a welcoming environment for riders. And one easy way to do that is through public arts programs in creating, if the public, if a train stop, was a welcoming environment that had like street vendors and food and like a mural arts program, and had, a combination of transit ambassadors who are helping people find their way in a very confusing transit system, or almost in cities like Bogota and in countries like Colombia, they have these almost like de-escalation tactics through performance art that have actually led to effective results. The same thing in Mexico City subway. They've used like clowns. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but like clowning techniques to inform subway patrons about proper behavior when commuting, and helping people find their way. In Bogota, they used traffic cops with mimes. Like, I know it sounds really silly and really stupid, but the idea or ability to make a public transit station an actual public space where everyone can feel welcomed and everyone can take control of the community in that space, and there will not be a need for the police there. And I think in turn, then people will feel safe. And I think this issue is really difficult because when we talk to transit riders, I think that there is a understanding amongst like younger, more urbanist-esque public transit riders, or folks who are, on this bad bandwagon of like police abolition, who get it. But then there are people who are native to Philadelphia, who have lived here their entire lives, who ride the system every day, who genuinely feel safe with police presence upon public transit. And there's no way that you could tell that person otherwise. And so, and I think it's the feeling of security comes from the feeling of there is some sort of not enforcement, but like supervision, and where the supervision can be done by community members and not police. I think that can be like the most effective.
Thank you so much for those fascinating examples from Bogota and Mexico City. That's really interesting to hear the tactics that are working to de-escalate and reduce the footprint of the police in transit systems. At this time, I'm going to announce the second of 3 CLE passwords. The second CLE password is transit. Again, that's transit, TRANSIT. Thank you. While the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of the structural flaws in the program or in our system, and you've both reflected on that, I think that it's also forced a much needed conversation on transportation equity and human mobility. So we sort of talked about the negatives, but I'd like to reflect a little bit, if we can, on the positives. What innovative possibilities for the future of mobility justice in Philadelphia have emerged during the past 2 years?
Yeah, I will say, so as I mentioned before, there is, work being done to help, repair some of the broken systems, and really to implement a process that is, that the community members are involved in the process. I know from my work at Otis, I know that, not just the Indigo program, but also the folks on the Complete Streets team, every aspect of programming that we do at Otis has a community engagement wing to it. And that was not always, that hasn't always been the case. But I know now, with all of the project, there's a community engagement wing, and there's conversation of like, how can we involve the community more, and making sure that, community involvement doesn't just mean listening to the loudest voices in the room, or, putting out a survey or having a meeting and just, taking the word of who attended. Because oftentimes, everybody's not going to attend a community meeting. Everybody may not respond to your survey. Everybody may not see it. It depends on how you're sharing it out, the channels that you're using. So really taking the time to be strategic about how you're getting feedback, and not just any feedback, but feedback from everyone in the community, making sure that the folks that respond to your question, that respond to your survey, the feedback that you're getting, that the demographics are representative of the neighborhoods that you're looking to serve. And that process often takes a bit more time. You know, a lot of times, a lot of these projects, you know, people want to be able to do things quick and implement things fast. But, you know, community engagement isn't about quick and fast. It's about doing it right. And it's also about trust too. I think that's something that people don't often really understand, is that this engagement process is about trust. And the whole reason why it's a lot tougher sometimes is because there's so much mistrust for the way the process has been done throughout history. So sometimes you may come into a community and with the best intentions, but that community member may not want to hear what you have to say, just because I've heard people come in and say one thing and do another thing. Or I've seen projects being implemented without, you know, really taking in our feedback or our concerns. So why should I trust what you're bringing to the table, right? So you really have to, you know, keep coming back, really showing through example that you mean what you say and that you're really working to, you know, to build that trust. And sometimes that takes time, but I will say, I know from experience, when you take the time to do it right, to do the process right, to build that trust, to have that community driven process, it gets so much easier. You know, like with Indigo, when we were first implementing this work, you know, people were like, what's Indigo? What's bike share? Oh, no, I don't know about that. But then after seeing us really come out and have these conversations, and then having people come back, you know, a year or two later and say, oh, I remember you came to our community and you got our feedback and I saw it implemented. I remember when you all came here, you know, a year ago or 2 years ago. Like, I always hear those conversations. And that's, you know, that helps the next conversation that we're having with another community. Oh yeah, we heard, you know, you did this over there. We would like to have that implemented here. You know, so when you set the tone and you build that trust, it becomes easier down the line. It's just taking the time to really, you know, build that trust and do the process right. So.
Yeah, and I'll add just really quickly to that. I used to work for the Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philadelphia, which was the education arm of Indigo's bike share system and the Better Bike Share Partnership. And as a community liaison, you know, as Wafia was saying, building that trust, the Better Bike Share Partnership at Indigo really did the work of building those connections and that trust with community members. Something so simple as giving free bicycle training classes to community members, and, you know, teaching them how to ride a bicycle for free or riding an Indigo bike for free, is how you build that trust. And I think, you know, as a community liaison, that was such a rewarding experience to see people's genuine excitement and happiness riding Indigo, especially when you're offering them a service for free and you're teaching them on top of that. And you're also asking them to, you know, provide their feedback about where they would want bike share, Indigo, and things like that. So shout out to Otis and Indigo and the Better Bike Share Partnership, because they've really done that work, which has been great. On the public transit side, I think the simple fact that we are able to have conversations about alternatives to police on public transit is a promising step forward. Now, this is something that has been screamed from the rooftops for years and years. And it's about time that finally this conversation is being had in a more public or accessible way. It's definitely not enough, but I think it is important to recognize that the fact that alternatives to police in public transit or in general has come into the zeitgeist or the, you know, the public sort of sphere of public conversation is a positive. I think that has also then allowed for transit agencies like SEPTA to kind of reflect and take a step back and realize, you know, who are their riders that they're serving. And for a very long time, and still to this day, actually, the SEPTA board is made up mostly of white suburban residents. The board itself, there's 13 members on the board. Only 2 members represent the city of Philadelphia, yet the majority of funding and the majority of fare box revenue that comes to SEPTA is from the city of Philadelphia riders, and where SEPTA operates within the city. But with that being said, the transit agency itself took a step back and sorry, my cat is wanting to join the conversation today. The transit agency SEPTA, at the beginning of the pandemic, like it was in March, they released their fare restructuring plan, and one of the plans was to increase transit fares by 50 cents for SEPTA key card users. And when the pandemic hit and there were folks who, there was immediate unemployment and a ton of job loss, SEPTA made a declaration and I think upheld a commitment to equity that the new general manager, emphasized as important, and actually blocked a fare increase for SEPTA key users, and they've kept that decrease in fare, or that the preventing of an increase in fares up until July of this year. And I think there will be probably another evaluation as to whether or not that fare would increase. So I think that's it's a very small kind of step, but I think it's something that's absolutely worth highlighting and worth recognizing. I think too, other sort of kind of positives that I have seen come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, or in terms of supporting mobility justice, I think SEPTA is, has also, they're now allowed riders to transfer from one form of transit to another completely for free. Before, they would charge riders a dollar transfer fee. And I think recognizing that not everyone has the privilege or the opportunity to be able to afford public transit, and in the small ways in which they can make public transit more affordable, I think are positive steps. And I would love to see them go further in implementing things like a low-income fare program, or a system where folks can tap multiple times with one key card, or a program that does away with a monthly or weekly pass. And if a rider ends up spending as much money as they would within a week, that would equate to a weekly pass, that if they, let's say they took, within 2 days out of a week, they accumulated how much it would cost to buy a weekly transit pass, that the rest of the 5 days of that week, they would be able to ride for free. It's an idea in a system called fare capping, where your fare essentially caps if you've reached the weekly transit pass or monthly transit pass threshold. So I think the positives are small, and it's always as Wafia said, it's not a quick and immediate hit. It's a slow building, and you build upon it each time. And so I think, like everything, it's always going to take a lot of work and a lot of time to get to where we want to truly be.
On the subject of authentic models of community engagement, I was wondering if we could talk about 1 or 2 case studies from the last year or so that I think really crystallize some of the issues that we're talking about. The first being the sudden and unexpected closure of the Kensington L station last year, and the second being the current controversy over the Washington Avenue overhaul. And I'm wondering if either or both of you can speak to the ways and to sort of distill for us a situation for those of us who might not know. And second, to talk about the ways that this is sort of embodying or reifying some of the inequality that we've been talking about today.
Do you want to go first, Wafia? Okay. The immediate closure of the of the train stops over in Kensington was, I think those closures needed to happen. The improvements needed to happen at those transit stops, but unfortunately, our transit agency, SEPTA, does not have the strongest streak or strongest sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? I think that they've been burned so many times by the public that they're afraid to engage with them in certain projects. And I think, though, that this idea of fear of public engagement or community engagement is actually shifting away and is actually no longer the case. There's projects like the Bus Revolution Project, reimagining regional rail, and their wayfinding master plan that has had extensive amounts of public engagement and community outreach to include riders within those conversations. But the closure of the stops in Kensington was a really good example of how SEPTA would normally kind of operate, in terms of just closing the stop with zero communication to the public or the community for people who are relying and depending on this stop to get to and from work, to and from healthcare appointments. And it was really cool to see the backlash of that. And it was really cool to see that immediately, once the public and the community came forward and said, hey, this is not okay, and that there were like protests and marches around the station, that SEPTA then backtracked and realized, oh, we need to speak with, and they reached out to the New Kensington Community Development Corporation, and were able to have conversations and be able to be transparent about their timeline for when the station would be closed and when it would be reopened. I think when it comes to effective, engagement and outreach, it is transparency, and really obviously listening, but then showing that you're listening and respecting the community, right? And speaking to them with dignity, and not as if that that the transit agency, the urban planner, or the engineer is the expert. No, the community is the expert. They ride that system day in, day out. They see what's happening on the ground every day. They are the expert. And I think using as many experts as possible in the conversation will lead to effective policies that could potentially then prevent things like a protest or a march happening when you're refusing to engage with the public. I think it's utilizing all of those resources together.
Yeah, I would say so. For the Washington Ave, that isn't a project that I worked as closely on as some of my other colleagues and team members at Otis, but I will say from my perspective of the project and from what I've seen of other team members, I think this is an example of what I was speaking about before, is community engagement can't just be the feedback of the loudest voices in the room, or those who may respond to do the immediate response to a survey. Is really making sure that the feedback that you're getting is reflective of the entire community that that you're serving. And so, as I mentioned, sometimes that process may not go as quickly or as smoothly as some people would like it to go, but you have to take that extra steps to really build that trust and build those conversations. And so really making sure that you're hearing from the especially hearing from members of the community that have lived there forever, right? Those historical members that have seen so many different changes happen in the community, whether it be related to transportation or not related to transportation. Like when they're talking about, changes in their community, they can't just think about the transportation, right? They have to think about everything that impacts that community, right? And how this, new infrastructure may impact this business or this neighborhood or, my house, my property, my children, my school, right? So it's not as simple as a, yes or no. So I think those things need to be taken and have to be taken into consideration when we're talking about the community engagement process, and that it really, people come from a place of community engagement depending on their lived experience and how it affects their mode of travel and other concerns that they have. For some people, they're like, when sometimes you go out to a community and you're like, hey, I want to talk about this bike lane, or I want to talk about this indigo station. They're like, hey, I want to talk about this air conditioner that's been broke at the rec center since 2018, right? That we've been calling about and complaining about and haven't had anyone come out to respond to it. But yet you want to come out and talk to me about this, right? So that's where that trust building, that's where that conversation comes in. That's when, when you're a part of an organization and when people see someone coming to talk to them, they're like, okay, how can we get all of these things fixed? Because this might not be top of mind for us, right? So you have to think about that whole community and some of the things that they're trying, that they may be dealing with and how it all fits into that built environment. And so, as I mentioned, it may not be a fast process. It may, be a little bit longer, but it comes down to building that trust and making sure that you're getting a proper assessment from everyone in that community, and then using that feedback to try to, implement a process that can fit in with, the ideas and views of everyone.
Thank you so much. That's super helpful and enlightening. Zooming back out to my inspiration in designing this panel, Octavius Cato. I think that Octavius Cato had the temerity to imagine a more just and equal transit system at a time that was marked by such inequality, oppression, and segregation. And I'm wondering what you think that we can all do as individuals, as law students who may be in Philadelphia for a lifetime or maybe only 3 years, or future lawyers, to use the levers of power and community action to force change.
Yeah, I will say, so, I'll use myself as an example. Whenever I'm asked to, speak on a project or talk about a project or provide feedback or even jump onto a project, I'm looking at who else is a part of that conversation, who else is sitting at that table with me. And if I'm not seeing, the residents, or if I'm not seeing, the community leaders, or if I'm not seeing, if the folks that if the folks that need to be a part of the conversation aren't a part of the conversation, then I'm going to say, why isn't so-and-so here? If you want me to be a part of this, I need you to also be bringing on this person and that person, so being able to also use your leverage and use your power to make sure that you're providing that connection and, providing, those seats at the table, however you want to say it, for others that need to be there. And also using your voice to also, speak up in support for others that may be a part of this work, or even others that are doing this work. Because I can tell you from someone who's, been a part of, the work of like equity and access, and, is really rooted in everything that I do. It's not an easy job. It's not an easy task. It's not always easy to, talk about, the conversations that need to happen, right? Like you can't just always talk about transportation without talking about race, without talking about inequality. You have to have these conversations, and they're often uncomfortable, but you have to learn to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so also providing that support for others that have been doing this work, because that are, maybe your coworkers, or, maybe others, checking in on them. but also just using your voice to not only, speak up for the work and speak up for others that need to be a part of the conversation, but also, speaking up for and supporting those that are doing this work on an everyday basis who don't always get, that support or those kudos, or, even that just self-care that needs to happen to come that, that needs to be taken into account when you're doing this work.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Wafia there that it's, and I think it's in the question too, leveraging the power that you have. So I think first it's recognizing what power do you have? Where are you able to potentially disrupt what is happening, right? If you're seeing something on a train that you see is, not acceptable or is causing discomfort to others, recognizing, first, okay, well, what power do I have? What makes me feel safe? Where can I use my voice to disrupt, what is occurring and what is happening? It doesn't even have to also be on public transit specifically. It could be at a city council hearing. It could be at a SEPTA board meeting. It could be, talking to your community, talking to your neighbors. I think it's one, using your voice, and for folks who are in positions of actual power, to be willing to sacrifice that power and share that power with folks who, either folks in the community or folks who don't have the same access. And that's going to make the people in power uncomfortable. I think it's going to make, it's going to feel strange. It's going to feel vulnerable, but I think it's what's necessary to be done to actually enact change. If you think about, what are the sacrifices that someone like Octavius Cato made, it was his livelihood, right? The threat of being sent to jail, the threat of death, essentially. So I think it's recognizing what power you have, using your voice to utilize that, within what feels safe to you, what you're willing to be able to sacrifice to enact that change. And maybe sacrifice isn't the right word, but I think it's what are you able to do to better the environment around you? What are you able to do to, relieve the suffering of another person with the power or the privilege or the resources that you have available? I think, and that's just kind of speaking in kind of broad terms, but I think from a more sort of action kind of specific way, I think that there's opportunities that folks, very simple things that folks may not recognize as an opportunity to share power or to share wealth, that are actually very simple human to human kind of one-on-one interactions. Like I think I mentioned before, like speaking to your neighbors, getting to know your neighbors, know your community members, knowing public transit riders, right? Knowing your operator. There's a really great question in the Q&A that I hope I'm able to kind of answer, but getting to know who your operator is, thanking them for their dedication and sacrifice they made to keep our transit system moving during a global health crisis. It sounds strange, but something as simple as just having a conversation and seeing someone as an equal to you, and knowing that they're just as much of an expert as you are, can really help then dismantle sort of the hierarchies that are in place, and thinking that a SEPTA agency official or a police officer is more knowing than a SEPTA operator, or a regular transit rider. I think the more you're able to get to know your community and speak to your community to understand what the issues are, and allow the folks who are within that community to be the leaders of the movement, and where you're able to kind of either amplify or support them, I think is kind of one of the strongest things that we can do as people.
Thank you so much for those powerful reflections. Before we transition into the fantastic question in the Q&A, I am going to announce the third and final CLE password. The third and final CLE password is justice, JUSTICE. Again, that's justice, JUSTICE. Regina asks, where do the transportation workers and their unions fit into this conversation? Are they caught in the middle between the transit system and the passengers and others impacted by transit or transportation systems?
Yes, absolutely they are. And I think that they are integral and crucial to this conversation. As I was mentioning earlier, that transit justice or issues around public transit are also labor issues. The operators and drivers of the SEPTA system are literally the eyes and ears of the system. And I think the recognition for their efforts beyond the duties that they're quote unquote required to do, I think that they should be at the decision-making table when it comes to a lot of policies that SEPTA is implementing. Because not only are they community members themselves, but as I said before, they're riding the system every day and knowing what's going on. They're also the first line of communication for transit riders. They're the first people that that meet and speak with transit riders. And I think unions, I think it's unfortunate that our local union and SEPTA, their relationship is not as strong, I think, as it could be, and it's usually around contract negotiations. And I think where SEPTA is able to show that the TWU Local 234 is a priority for them, then allows for operators and drivers to feel like they are part of the system, and that they're not just employers of SEPTA, but that they are actually SEPTA. And I think that they are absolutely critical and integral to this conversation. And then in regards to them being caught in between the agency and riders is a very, very real reality that is very difficult actually to navigate. Our coalition has been doing work around the bus network redesign of happening here in SEPTA, called the Bus Revolution Project. And when we hear from riders who speak about the challenges and difficulties they have with operators, it's really hard to hear, because on one end, I think a lot of what they're saying is absolutely valid and true. But on the other end, I think what operators and drivers are forced to endure are not necessarily always the responsibility of a driver. Having a driver having to deal with someone having a mental health crisis, or a driver having to deal with someone suffering from addiction, or a driver having to deal with someone suffering or who is experiencing homelessness, is not necessarily within the confines of their job description. So it's a very, very difficult place that they're put in. And I think where we're able to uplift and support our drivers and operators as much as possible, I think can really really kind of at least get to kind of scratching the surface with that issue.
With the last few remaining minutes that we have, I'd love to raise another question in the chat. What do you each hope for the future of Philadelphia Transit?
That's a big one. I mean, and I'll say for me, my hopes for the future, especially as a transit rider and cyclist and pedestrian, and I don't have a driver's license yet, but one day maybe. I use, I intersect with all of these different modes, and so for me, it would be having a transportation system that is accessible to any and everyone. Accessible in terms of reliability, affordability, also that folks feel safe and comfortable as well, traveling along the different modes. I think, the conversation around personal safety is one that's really real, especially when you're talking about, minorities and, underserved communities and communities of color, being able to feel safe when you're traveling on these modes at any point in the time of the day is a really big one. So yeah, a transit system that's reliable, safe, accessible, and really get you from point A to point B in the time that you need to get there. The hardest thing to hear, I remember when I was chatting with folks about transit, and I heard a story from a student who was in high school. And he was sharing that, he had a really great internship, but ended up losing his internship because, trying to make it from school to the internship on time was so difficult for him. Sometimes the bus, it wouldn't get there at the time that he needed it to get there. And, how many times can you show up and say, I'm sorry, the bus was late, right? And he's got no other way to get, from school to the internship than with that training. You can't just leave school early, because of transit. So being able to have a system where things like that don't happen.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Wafia said. And I'll say on the reliability and frequency end, I would love to see, one of the major challenges for folks who have recently been incarcerated in trying to keep their jobs has been the lack of public transit or transportation to and from their jobs. And so I think one vision for that I would like to see Philadelphia Transit to see happen would be a system where people don't lose jobs because the bus or the train was late. That people don't lose in internship because of that. Another big sort of vision that I would like to see for the city of Philadelphia when it comes to public transit, and this is something I would love to see in every city. I would love to see every single bus stop and train stop be ADA accessible. And that is something that is required by law under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there is no public transit. There's no public transit agency across the country that is 100% fully ADA accessible. And I think that's just a damn shame. And I think it's crazy to think about how there are some people who are just not allowed or able to ride public transit, which is a public utility and a public good. And then lastly, I would love to see either fare-free public transit or some sort of low-income fare program where affordability is not a barrier for people to get to and from where they need to go. And I'll just leave it at that.
I think that that's a perfect place to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Wafia and Yasha, for this generative, inspiring conversation. And to all of our guests and attendees, that concludes the 41st Spare Symposium on Transportation and Mobility Justice. We hope that you leave today with a deeper understanding of how transportation systems entrench inequality, racial segregation, and economic disparity. We also hope that our conversations have inspired you to imagine how such transportations can support liberation, human mobility, and freedom. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and guests, and have a good night.